Hi everyone, it's Matt DeFanis, broker, owner of RE/MAX Realty Associates with offices in Champaign, Mahomet, and Monticello, Illinois. February is Black History Month, and coincidentally, I've been working on an online fair housing module that is part of a continuing education package for real estate licensees in the state of Illinois. And in so doing, I've been kind of steeped again in fair housing issues, which has become a real hot button for me, quite by happenstance through just a series of experiences and friendships that I never would have foreseen in a million years. I've become an avid student of fair housing, civil rights, and Black history in just the last few years. And so what I wanted to share with you is just a very small subset, very small, because I could talk about this stuff for hours, but I won't for you, about the history of housing discrimination in Illinois and specifically in the city of Chicago. If you're a real estate licensee, you've heard the term redlining because it is hammered into you both as a pre-licensed student and also in all of your continuing education cycles that that's a prohibited practice, that violates fair housing laws. For those of you who aren't familiar, redlining was the practice of lenders drawing red lines around certain neighborhoods on the basis of the race of the residents of the neighborhoods, and then refusing to lend money in those neighborhoods. And let me show you what that looks like. So this is part of an interactive redlining map compilation that now exists online that was the result of multiple academic institutions collaborating to put these together. So I'll show you in the city of Chicago a specific example of what redlining looked like. So we're going to examine this particular little area. This is in a part of the city that would now be called Bronzeville. The northern boundary of this area sits just south of McCormick Place. It includes a little bit of lake frontage and then extends south from there. Now, these maps, the one I'm showing you, were promulgated by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. That was a government-sponsored enterprise that was created as part of the New Deal during the FDR era. And so this was a government-sponsored enterprise somewhat equivalent to what Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae are to the mortgage industry today. It doesn't make loans. The government wasn't making the loans. The government was helping to insure the loans. And in areas where those loans could be insured, access to home mortgages was cheap and easy and readily accessible to white people. If you were in a red line neighborhood, you could not get mainstream mortgage financing. And we'll talk about in just a minute what the alternative looked like. So here's what that neighborhood looked like, and I'm going to read to you the actual margin notes written in that Homeowners Loan Corporation redlining map. And those notes were written by realtors and appraisers, and the maps came out in the late 30s and early 40s. And the photos that you're going to see accompanying this verbiage are public domain photos. These were shot by a photographer that was hired by the United States government as part of a project, and it was documenting the Black community in the city of Chicago, and these were taken in the early 40s. So coincidentally, we have this rich library of images that happens to be same place, time, and subject matter as what the maps are covering. So here are the margin notes for that neighborhood in the city of Chicago. With approximately 6,500 colored people moving into the district, it's evident they cannot be closed in. They must have an outlet, and the problem of keeping park and water frontage close by reasonably free of them will be difficult to surmount. The trend of the colored people will now be accelerated toward this park and water frontage, which many people consider could have been avoided had it been located west of Indiana. This is in reference to a new housing project. It is believed, particularly since the advent of the housing project, that this entire section will ultimately go colored, which will increase the number of colored people using the lakefront. Washington Park is already doomed. And there you see a picture of Washington Park being enjoyed by, oh yeah, white people in pretty dresses. That was redlining. So I was unaware that Martin Luther King Jr. had spent a fair bit of time in the city of Chicago during the civil rights movement. And a quote that I was not aware of until fairly recently was what you see on the screen right now. This is from 1966. I've been in many demonstrations all across the South, but I can say I've never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hostile and as hate-filled as I've seen here in Chicago. And I'll show you a series of photographs of what that looked like. So here is Dr. King trying to recover from having been hit in the head with a fist-sized rock thrown by a member of a white mob. And this wasn't just some random civil rights march. This was a march with a purpose. This was a march through an all-white neighborhood to a real estate office to protest housing discrimination in the city of Chicago. So that's August 5th of 1966. And these are photos of white mobs looking to keep neighborhoods segregated in the city of Chicago. So then you kind of get to this issue of, this has obviously long since been made illegal. So then you ask the question, well, so what was the actual cost of that housing discrimination? And what kind of residual effect does that have? Because it was very easy for me until recently to say, well, that's been illegal going back decades, and so we're good now, but not exactly. So let me show you. There's been some recent, really robust studies done to calculate the cost of that housing discrimination. And here's probably the best, most recent one. The report is called The Plunder of Black Wealth in Chicago. And it's a research study from the Samuel Dubois Cook Center on Social Equity, published just in the last several months. So it's looking at the period of the 50s and 60s primarily. So in the post-World War II era, 1940 to 1960, homeownership rate in general in the U.S. was spiking up from 43% up to 62%. That's huge. That was baby boomer era. Tons of new houses were being built. Tons of VA financing was readily available to white people. White Americans had easy access to low-cost, low-interest government-backed loans. Black Americans did not. They were forced into a secondary, unregulated market of contract sales. And it's estimated that between 75 and 95% of homes that were sold to black families during the 50s and 60s were these contract sales, contract for deed. Typical price markup on those deals was 84%. In 2019 inflation-adjusted dollars, that meant that the black families were paying an average extra monthly payment of $587 more for their home purchases on contract for deed. Over the 2 decades studied, so this is just the 50s and 60s, just in the black community, just in Chicago, between $3.2 billion and $4 billion expropriated from the black community. And there is the URL if you want to look up the report. And so that has a long-term hangover effect. As I started to take a deep dive over the last few years into this particular area of black history and housing discrimination, I went from, well, that's vocabulary terminology in a textbook and that's a thing of the past, to realizing I won't live long enough to see that damage undone and fully rectified. And you think about somebody that's my age, I'm in my 40s, and you look at my black counterparts, and neither of my parents came from moneyed backgrounds. And yet, if you were white in the United States of America, it was quite easy to buy and finance a home. And for middle-class families, home ownership is the most potent form of wealth building that they have. And you just saw that my black counterparts, people of their parents' cohort, were generally shut out of that ability. And so you look at, again, both of my parents came from fairly modest family backgrounds, and yet they both had at least something of a nest egg to inherit from their parents, and they were able to build wealth through easy home ownership. By contrast, you look at folks who had no access to that, no access to the wealth building, no access to home equity lines of credit, no ability to tap into that to be able to pay for emergency expenses, fix a car, send a kid to college. And so as a result, all these years later, you can still see that the city of Chicago's housing patterns are segregated very much along the lines of the redlining map that largely created a self-fulfilling prophecy, the aftermath of which we are still grappling with decades and decades later. So if you're still watching, thank you for hanging with me on this. I hope you learned something new from this. And as I said, this is my little snippet of where Black history intersects with housing. So thanks for watching. I appreciate you hanging out with me.